Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It's Friday, March 13th, and the 2026 legislative session is officially over. I'm your host, Tim Clouser, in for Carleen, who's out for today. In today's episode, we'll dig into how the state balanced a multi-billion-dollar deficit by, you guessed it, raising spending by $2 billion. We'll hear the governor's take on the investments he appreciated in the budget, propped up around a controversial income tax that he helped take to the finish line. Then, we'll hear what House Republican budget leader Travis Couture had to say on the floor last night about the bloated budget. Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson sang a different tune, arguing that the majority made Washington more affordable for taxpayers. We'll also hear from one of our reporters about what state legislators can keep secret, and Carleen has a report on Obamacare subsidies going to fund your local Planned Parenthood. The House and Senate gavelled out around 8:30 p.m. on Thursday, bringing the state legislative session to a close just after approving the operating budget. 7 Democrats joined every Republican in opposition to the $2 billion spending hike. It even set off alarms across the state house. Well, kind of. After the House sent the operating budget to the Senate for final approval, someone or something set off the fire alarms, sending both chambers back to caucus for a little while. It didn't stop the majority party from passing its spending package, though. After a quick debate in the Senate, the deed was done. The budget balances out over 4 years due to a few things. First, Democrats cut millions in child care subsidies, public education, and more. Then, they pulled nearly half of the state's reserves into the general fund to help fill the hole, promising to backfill the rainy day fund in 2029 after reserves build back up. But that can only happen if the party's potentially unconstitutional income tax doesn't fall apart before it takes effect in 2028. The plan was to wait for the tax to raise $2 billion or more, then snag millions of dollars from a pension fund for first responders to plug the rainy day account. If the income tax is blocked by the courts or an initiative on the ballot, that pension money could end up filling another general fund deficit in the future. That would set a dangerous precedent of turning to retirement accounts to inflate spending, though Democrats argue this one is more than solvent enough to handle the blow. The budget did include some perks for taxpayers, but Republicans say that's offset by an increasing tax burden that is pushing Washingtonians and businesses to other states. After the final gavel, Governor Bob Ferguson held a press conference where he touted the Democrats' achievements throughout the session.
I asked for historic investments in housing to respond to the housing crisis that we have. Invested over $200 million in affordable housing. It's a record for a supplemental budget in Washington state. I asked for a truly historic investment in our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges. A 6-year investment in infrastructure of $1.5 billion, and they met every penny on that one. So that will make a huge difference for us in making a big step forward on addressing the real backlog we have of trying to get our infrastructure where it needs to be, which helps people, which helps our economy, and which is good for jobs. The millionaire's tax, obviously, I called for adopting that and was specific that, hey, we need to put a significant amount of the revenue from the millionaire's tax back in the pockets of Washingtonians and business owners. And by any fair measure, they did that as well. You might say they say I specifically called out the working families tax credit to increase that, and they increased it to the tune of adding 460,000 families across our state will now receive the working families tax credit. Check literally in the mail between $300 and $1,300. Big tax break for business owners, and all the other things you saw in the millionaire's tax of dollars back in the pockets of Washingtonians. So I was extremely pleased with the free meals, breakfast and lunch for our K through 12 students. Big priority of mine when I ran for office.
House Republican budget leader Travis Couture took a very different view, pleading with Democrats to vote against the massive spending increase amid back-to-back budget deficits. He ran through the sacrifices Democrats made at the expense of taxpayers in this budget. After Washingtonians shouldered the largest tax increase in state history last year.
I want to talk a little bit about what this budget does. A $4 billion raid of a law enforcement officers and firefighters left one pension, and an unconstitutional, economy-shattering income tax, which will in no time apply to the middle class, crushing our economy and producing capital flight. This budget represents over $1.2 billion in Medicaid cuts, cuts to dementia care, cuts to assisted living, cuts to nursing homes, cuts to dialysis treatment. That wasn't because of H.R. 1, that was because of this budget and this legislature's negligence in budgeting. When families have a hard time, they tighten their belts and they cut down to the essentials and they cut their spending. But when government has a hard time, it raises your taxes, raises your pensions, and grows itself on the backs of those people, and that's wrong. This budget doesn't make life more affordable in Washington. It doesn't help the senior citizens afford their property taxes on fixed incomes. It doesn't help the mom to fill up her gas tank or buy groceries. It doesn't do any of that. As a matter of fact, the further you get from reality, the easier this budget looks.
Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson disagreed, telling reporters after lawmakers wrapped up business on the House and Senate floor that this supplemental budget makes Washington more affordable for taxpayers. I guess you'll just have to see how your wallet responds to Olympia this time around. Let's hear what Peterson had to say.
We wanted to make Washington more affordable. We passed the millionaire's tax, which is going to make sure that people are not, small businesses are getting the biggest tax break in history. People are not going to be paying sales tax anymore when it goes into effect on grooming and hygiene products, on over-the-counter medicines, on diapers, adult or baby diapers. We have a way to fix an upside-down tax system that's been plaguing us for 90 years and provide adequate revenue that we can make investments in things that the people of our state care about. So I think that has given us a lot of hope.
I don't know about you, but this session was only 60 days long, and it felt longer than last year's 105-day stretch. Let's take a break from the bills and spending lawmakers passed this year and hear from our investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, about a recent court decision about what state lawmakers are allowed to keep secret, at least for now. Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clouser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about a recent Washington appeals court ruling that gives lawmakers more cover to withhold internal records under legislative privilege. TJ, why don't you tell us what legislative privilege is, what changed, and why should residents even care about this?
Well, it really comes down to whether or not the public has access to the internal discussions of lawmakers about a bill before they go onto the chamber floor or during a public hearing. And so what happened is that the legislature tried to withhold records that were requested from media outlets like the Associated Press. They sued. The Washington State Supreme Court in 2019 ruled that the legislature was subject to the Public Records Act. And so the legislature responded by using a provision in our state constitution to claim legislative privilege. And what this provision has to do with the fact that nothing that someone says on the floor of the Senate or House can be used. They can't be charged for a crime or a civil infraction. So they can pretty much say whatever they want, and there's no legal consequences. And that argument is to protect their their right to free speech. So they're applying that to internal discussions about emails or regard that, emails, memos, whatever. And so there was a group of people who brought a lawsuit against the legislature this second time around, and the courts have actually sided so far with the legislature, ruling that they do have legislative privilege and that they can redact or withhold records. And so the latest was the Court of Appeals that ruled in favor of the legislature, and it's possible it could go to the state Supreme Court, but we don't know yet. The plaintiffs would have to appeal it.
And why might residents want to see records like this, see internal legislative deliberations? What kind of insight would that give them into, say, the upcoming legislative session leading up to it? I mean, we're right at the end of it now, but what would that have allowed everyday residents to see?
I think one argument could be, the cynic could argue that the chamber floor discussions are just political theater. It's people reading prepared statements that they're going to put out. They've already got their press releases ready to send out. And so when they're being frank and truly, I don't want to use the word sincere, but it's where they're just speaking their mind is in these internal emails and communications. These internal records are where they're actually giving what they think, as opposed to going out onto the floor where they're being recorded. It's being taken down. They're not legally liable for what they say, but they do have to keep in mind that people are listening and what they say can be quoted, as opposed to internal discussions where they can say things where, I mean, imagine with the income tax where the lawmakers openly admit that they think it's illegal, but they don't care. That would
Mhm.
be like somebody who gets on the House or Senate floor and says, this tax is necessary, but in private they're saying, yeah, it's not necessary, but we want it anyways. I mean, so it would allow it would either force lawmakers to watch what they say in private, or it would give the public an understanding of what their lawmakers, their elected officials, and representatives actually think.
Mhm. It's interesting to see, you spoke to it a little bit, the Senate and House floor being theater for these politicians where they might speak their minds but say things, different things behind closed doors, whether that be in person or in emails. I know the legislative privilege goes more towards the emails, but it would be interesting to hear what these people are saying in private with just each other, because you see some pretty heated testimony on the House and Senate floor. And like you said, these are things that are recorded, they're clipped, they go on social media, and they go viral. But a lot of people don't know that some of these lawmakers live with each other in Olympia while they're in the legislative session. Not just Republicans with Republicans and Democrats with Democrats, but Democrats living with Republicans. Not to say that that's any sort of crazy idea or anything, but just the other day, the Senate had this resolution on the floor, and they were honoring Senator Judy Wardnick for all her time in the legislature before she retires, and Senator Noel Frame, which has pushed a lot of these progressive tax proposals. She spoke to her experience living with Senator Wardnick the last few years in Olympia and how they have had sort of heated discussions over certain legislation. For example, um, Catholic priests being mandatory reporters of child abuse. They said that they had pretty heated discussions on that. And I wonder what those discussions were like in their apartment in Olympia. Like, have they been talking about the income tax? Because those could be really interesting and pretty insightful for residents. And it's a conversation that we probably will never have eyes into unless they were to say, tap these lawmakers, which is never going to happen.
Yeah, I think it really it speaks to what is actually going on in government and how do things actually work. Because on paper, the debates occur on the House floor and the Senate floor. In practicality, the debates and discussions go on well before that. And
Mhm.
nobody goes to the House floor or Senate floor with with ambiguity about how either they're going to vote or how others, like, they always, the caucuses count the votes. They know they don't bring a bill to the floor unless they know that they have the votes that are necessary. And so that means that they had discussions. What discussions were being had? Now, if it's verbal communication, that's obviously not subject to public disclosure. They're not walking around with audio recorders, or they're, I mean, their cell phones are, but that's a separate topic. But I think that, yeah, I think it really raises the issue of, to what extent does the public have a very accurate view of how lawmakers govern and how just the way of legislating actually occurs? Because, yeah, if you've got two people with diametrically opposed politics living in the same residency together, it's not like they just drop politics when they. I don't know. I've never. I I have no idea what it is like to live with someone who you potentially have to badmouth during an election campaign, right? So, how that works out is something that they might have to make a sitcom TV show about at some point. But yeah, the issue is whether or not it. Actually, what's interesting is there was a constitutional amendment that was proposed that would have made these records subject to public disclosure, but just provided the same legal protections as when they're on the House, the House and Senate chamber floors, right? So the same legal protections. And what's interesting is it got read, but it got no public hearing. And so um, I think that it begs the question of why did it get no support? Is it because they just they don't see it as necessary, or because it's not about legally protecting them? It's about just the pub. We don't want the public to even know what's going on. I don't. That's the question that has to be asked.
And was that bill that you just brought up, it stalled, it's dead this session, but, who proposed that bill? Was it a Democrat bill, a
That was
Republican
a
bill? We know that
Yeah,
Democrats have a near super majority in the legislature.
yeah. That was actually proposed by actually the Senate Local Government Committee Chair Jesse Solomon. Then that was Senate Joint Resolution 8211. So yeah, it was 2 Democrats. So I think that there's been Democrats who've also, I think Jerry Paulette has also said that he's open to, he thinks this stuff should be subject to public disclosure. So this is actually not a partisan issue down party lines. There's Democrats and Republicans who are in favor of it, and there's, those who are opposed to it. So I think that will be interesting to what extent this court rulings, if the state Supreme Court sides with the plaintiffs ultimately, then is that how they're going to respond by passing or proposing a constitutional amendment? Because that's a pretty big hurdle. You got to get 2/3 of the legislature. You got to get 2/3 of the voters to support it.
Yeah, I would like to hear the internal legislative deliberations behind that bill. I know that the bill stalled, but what were they saying behind closed doors, like, about that bill? Because it had bipartisan support, it sounds like, but interested to see if anyone was opposed to it. So this ruling that came out recently, is it do you think that it weakens the 2019 state ruling that said that lawmakers were subject to the PRA? That 2019 ruling said that they are subject to the Public Records Act. What do they have to disclose, and what don't they have to disclose based off this most recent ruling?
I think it's internal discussions about legislation. I think that's the what it's subject to. Also, I would add, this is attorney-client privilege, but any communications that they have with their attorneys would also be, redacted or exempt from public disclosure because it's a client talking to their attorney about legal stuff. So that's another exemption. So does it undermine the 2019 ruling? I think that it weakens it because without this, we would get these records. If the legislature didn't claim this privilege, then we would be getting stuff that I think that, because the thing is, if the 2019 ruling did exempt this stuff, the legislature wouldn't be using a new legal argument. They would be relying on the 2019 state Supreme Court ruling, which they're not. They're using a new legal argument because their prior one was, overturned by the high court.
Mhm. So you say that this could potentially go back to the Supreme Court, or this case. I know it was a separate case with the other one. When might that happen? Could there be a different appeal in a lower level, back in the appellate court, or would the next step be the state
It's got
Supreme
to be
Court?
this. I imagine it would be the state Supreme Court because there's Thurston County Superior Court that ruled in favor of the legislature. The Court of Appeals has ruled in favor of the legislature. I think the only option legally that they have left is go to the state Supreme Court. And so, uh, you know, we'll obviously be keeping an eye on this one because it obviously affects our work because these are records that we would in many cases we would want to get, but if this ruling is upheld, that we know we can't challenge it if they claim. I think the issue is no longer do they have legislative privilege. It becomes a fight over what constitutes what is it applied to, the same way that the attorney general's office can claim attorney-client privilege with certain communications. But I've appealed some of those in the past. I've got some under appeal right now, and so I think that's going to be the next fight if this is upheld. Is where's the line drawn between legislative privilege and where it begins and ends?
Mhm. Well, we're right at the end of the 2026 legislative session. They just passed a potentially unconstitutional income tax that's bound for legal challenges. They're expecting future budget challenges in the years ahead. If this was opened up, I would be really interested to see coming out of this session what tax proposals they're talking about behind closed doors for the next session. But we'll have to keep our eyes on this case as it potentially reaches the state Supreme Court again. But CJ, thank you for covering this. And for anyone hoping to catch future coverage or this article, you can read it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus. Now, Carleen has a report on ACA subsidies going to fund your local Planned Parenthood.
So, insurance companies in the state of Washington may soon need to foot the bill for additional abortion funding. A proposal passed on Wednesday evening in the state legislature to require health carriers with insurance plans offered on the Washington Health Benefit Exchange to pay a tax. So, this is Senate Bill 6182, and it would impose an assessment initially of 82 cents a month on coverage for each person that's enrolled in the program. It drops a little bit in the years after that. During a public hearing on this bill, it became very clear that Planned Parenthood, the organization that stands to benefit from the additional funding for abortion, was obviously very much on board with the legislation. So this is one of their advocates testifying in favor, and as you've probably heard before, blaming the Trump administration for cuts to what they call reproductive health care.
A creative revenue solution that supports abortion patients and safety net reproductive health providers. Under the ACA, health benefit exchange plan carriers are required to hold a portion of insurance premiums in a separate account for abortion care coverage, charging at least $1 per member per month. These funds far exceed the amount used for abortion care. The balance in Washington is approximately $13 million and generates another surplus of $2 million annually. But seeing an opportunity to score points with anti-abortion extremists, the Trump administration took aim, releasing an FAQ last month allowing insurance companies to absorb funding meant for abortion to their general account. Wiping out these funds violates the intent of ACA statute and diverges from how these funds have operated for over 10 years. This bill is an opportunity to right this wrong. By implementing this tax, Washington can protect funding for abortion care from abuse from the Trump administration. You will hear from many providers and organizations about the impact this funding will have for patients and community. SB 6182 rights this wrong by recouping segregated funds for their intended use, abortion care. Please pass SB 6182.
So in the first year, this tax is estimated to bring in about $10 million and then around $2 million each year after that. That was according to a fiscal analysis attached to the legislation. And insurers who don't, collect the extra money from their enrollees would pay fines. The insurance commissioner is going to be watching this very closely. Lots of organizations opposed to this, obviously religious objections and folks that, yes, say just because I get my, my coverage through the state health benefit exchange and the Affordable Care Act, I shouldn't have to pay for, maybe they've got religious objections to abortion and don't want money to be going to Planned Parenthood. But in this legislation, they're really not going to have any choice, at least at this point. I spoke to Representative Matt Marshall of Eatonville. He's sort of the U.S. Army, and he's also an orthopedic surgery physician assistant. He's kind of, they call him Dr. Marshall on campus. He tried to get an amendment on the abortion funding bill, basically arguing, well, okay, if this is actually a bill in the name of reproductive health care, then maybe we should let couples use some of this funding if they're having trouble getting pregnant, having fertility issues. So maybe you could pay for IVF treatments or that sort of a thing with some of the funding. So it can be as much pro-family as it could be, ending a life. So here's part of that conversation with Representative Marshall.
Democrats, yet again, are doubling down on abortions, trying to make it an issue going into the elections this November. Now, what this one does is it requires every health insurance plan in Washington to charge a fee, a tax, on every member in the state who has health insurance every single month. So I believe it's 86 cents per member per month that is going to go into a new account that's being created under this bill, and it's going to fund Planned Parenthood or abortion providers only. It's incredibly troubling. My biggest concern is the fact that there's strong moral obligations or moral objections to abortion, and there's no opt-out provision here, and it is something that is required for every health insurance plan, even if it's one being provided by a religious employer or a pro-life employer. You're being forced by the state to pay into this fund with no other recourse.
The measure ended up clearing the House late on Wednesday, and it was a party line vote with no Republicans in support. Now, I should also note, Planned Parenthood is separately getting a lot of money in the budget. $8.6 million for a backfill to Planned Parenthood from what was cut on the federal level, and then another $10 million that they're getting in the budget, yet to be signed, will be, I'm sure, by the time you're watching this, but this is before the new abortion fund that taxpayers are going to be on the hook for through these insurance premium hikes. So I had a member on the Senate side tell me this week that Planned Parenthood is getting more money in this legislative session than they ever have in the state of Washington. So that's been a priority for the majority this year, and they made it happen in the budget. So we'll keep an eye on that one.
That's it for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. Thank you for joining us, and to catch more of these stories, you can read them at thecentersquare.com. Have a good weekend. I'm your host, Tim Clouser.